They stood in lines, small feet firm on dusty school ground, eyes bright with something the world hadn't seen in African children for a long time. Certainty. With right hands raised to the sky and voices steady, they declared, "We will never betray our country. We have the best president in the world." It was not staged, it was not coached, it was conviction. And in a world where African youth are too often silenced, forgotten, or sold a dream made in foreign lands, these children were doing something radical. They were speaking truth, and the world was listening. But how did we get here? How did a generation, barely into their teens, begin chanting not about celebrities, not about foreign passports, but about patriotism? The answer lies in a decision, one bold signature, one revolutionary policy, one leader who said, "If we do not teach our children to love Africa, someone else will teach them to hate it." Stay with us, because this isn't just news. It's a blueprint for how nations are rebuilt. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that knows who it is. No press conference, no Western media coverage, no grand announcement at the United Nations. Instead, it was a simple signature penned with the weight of a continent behind it. On that quiet morning, President Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso signed into law something no African leader had ever dared: a nationwide patriotic immersion program, a new requirement, a new rite of passage, a new chapter in African education. From now on, every student in Burkina Faso who completes their national exams, whether in primary or secondary school, must undergo 3 weeks of civic training before advancing to the next level of education. This is not military conscription. It is not punishment. It is preparation. 3 weeks of physical training, not for war, but for discipline, endurance, and confidence. Civic education, not from foreign textbooks, but from local realities, oral history, and Pan-African principles. Historical immersion, not the colonial version, but the truth. Sankara, Lumumba, Nkrumah, Queen Nzinga, the names and blood that shaped a continent. This certificate, the attestation of patriotic immersion, is now legally required to continue academic progression. Without it, no student may proceed to lycée, university, or technical college. And it doesn't stop there. 3 government ministries of education, defense, and culture are now constitutionally bound to coordinate this program. The curriculum is African-led. The trainers are local. The supervision is communal. The goal is clear: to produce not just scholars, but citizens. Because what good is a degree if it serves only the interests of corporations abroad? What good is fluency in French if you forget the tongue of your grandmother? What good is knowledge if it never defends your people? This program is not an experiment. It is an intervention to heal the wound colonial education left behind. For too long, African students have been taught to memorize dates of European wars, names of European monarchs, capitals of distant lands, while knowing nothing of their own heroes, own revolutions, or even their own languages. This is the system Traoré has now shattered. And make no mistake, this is not symbolic. Thousands of students have already begun their immersion. Fields once used for sports now hold morning assemblies where children salute the flag with pride, not out of fear. Classrooms echo with songs that honor ancestors, not foreign conquerors. And across African news networks, something rare is being reported. A policy that is not imported, a law not written in Paris or Brussels, a decision born from the soil, for the soil. In a time when headlines speak of coups, debt, and despair, Burkina Faso is making history for something else, raising a generation that will not bow. And the world, though slow to admit it, has begun to watch. Because in these classrooms, beneath these uniforms, something is growing. Not indoctrination, but identity. In many countries, when a government announces a new education mandate, the response is predictable: skepticism, protests, bureaucracy. But in Burkina Faso, the patriotic immersion program was met with something very different: a wave of gratitude. From dusty villages to bustling towns, parents wept as they watched their children stand in uniform chanting, "I will serve my country with pride." For years, these parents had sent their children to schools that taught them more about Napoleon than Nkrumah, more about Versailles than Ouagadougou, more about European philosophers than African freedom fighters. Now, for the first time, they saw their children learning to love their own land. One mother in the province of Boucle du Mohun said it plainly, "My son used to talk about going to France. Now he talks about building Burkina Faso. That is all I ever wanted." Teachers, often undervalued and overworked, also felt a shift. No longer were they just dispensers of foreign-approved syllabi. Now they were transmitters of legacy. Elders in villages were invited to teach oral history. Local veterans led civic drills. Traditional musicians taught anthems of resistance. A headmaster from Bobo Dioulasso shared, "We used to teach children to pass exams. Now we teach them to defend their people." And then came the children themselves. With wide eyes and earnest voices, they began to write letters, hundreds of them, addressed not to celebrities or footballers, but to their president. "Thank you, Papa Traoré, for teaching us who we are. I want to protect my land like you do. My village is proud of you." These letters were not staged, they came unprompted. Some were written in French, some in Moray, some in Dioula, but the spirit was the same, a deep, sincere awakening. In rural Koudougou, one school gathered its students in the courtyard. There, barefoot and proud, they sang the national anthem, followed by a new pledge written by the children themselves. "We are the future of this land. We will learn, we will grow, and we will never betray our people." It was not nationalism, it was belonging. The flags they raised weren't waved with blind allegiance. They were held with love. Love for ancestors who fought. Love for the soil that raised them. Love for a future not dictated by Paris, but by principle. Even skeptics, at first suspicious of government policy, began to soften. Community leaders who had been vocal critics of past regimes said openly, "We may not agree with every method, but we cannot deny what we see in these children's eyes." And what did they see? Less obsession with European brands, more pride in local dress and languages, less interest in leaving the continent, more desire to stay, build, and lead. Social media, often flooded with escapist fantasies, began to shift. Videos of youth in training, lifting weights, reciting proverbs, reading Sankara's speeches, went viral. A 12-year-old girl named Aicha was filmed giving a speech during her immersion camp. She said, "We used to admire those who left. Now we admire those who stayed." That video reached over 1 million views in 2 days. Because in her words, the soul of a nation was speaking. The patriotic immersion program did more than fill a gap in the curriculum. It lit a fire in the hearts of children, a fire that now dances in the eyes of a continent that has waited too long to see itself. What began as a single policy in one West African nation has now become a continental conversation. The patriotic immersion program, once dismissed as a local experiment, is now stirring the minds and spirits of African educators, parents, and leaders from Nairobi to Dakar. News of children in Burkina Faso proudly singing their national anthem, not out of obligation but conviction, traveled far and fast. Within weeks, Ghanaian broadcasters ran panel discussions asking, should we teach patriotism, not just policy? In Kenya, an MP proposed a similar civic boot camp for final year students. In Nigeria, a teachers' union published an open letter to the Ministry of Education titled, "If Burkina Faso can do this, why can't we?" This isn't just policy envy, it's a cultural awakening. For too long, African schooling has mimicked European frameworks, importing language, ethics, history, and even behavior standards from distant capitals. Children have been trained to recite Shakespeare, but not Ngugi, to know the roads of Paris, but not the rivers of their homeland. But now, the script is changing. African children are standing straighter, speaking louder, and asking better questions. Who built our freedom? Why don't we celebrate our own heroes? What does it mean to serve my people? Diaspora communities are paying attention too. In Atlanta, a Pan-African youth center played videos from the patriotic immersion camps during their summer program. One mentor said, "Our kids have been searching for identity. Burkina Faso just handed them a map." In London, second-generation African teens watched viral clips of Burkina students pledging loyalty to their country. One boy whispered, "I've never seen that. We don't say things like that here. A movement is forming, not through loud protests, but through quiet clarity. Africa is asking itself a different set of questions. Not how do we get aid, but how do we get proud? And no, this is not just about Burkina Faso. This is about a Pan-African civic rebirth. New hashtags began to trend across African news platforms. Reclaim education, Yarahawan Sankara spirit, shall teach to serve, Yaran, African civic rise. Poets from Cameroon wrote verses honoring the program. Artists in Zimbabwe sketched murals of Traoré, surrounded by young students holding books and flags. A documentary crew from Senegal traveled to Ouagadougou to cover the camps. Even outside Africa, eyes are opening. Afro-descendant communities in Brazil and the Caribbean began sharing materials online. They asked hard questions. Why were we never taught to love Africa like this? Because the world expected African pride to fade, to be washed out by Western media, by pop culture, by economic hardship. But the children of Burkina Faso, standing in muddy schoolyards, barefoot and bold, have reminded everyone. Pride is not a luxury, it's a birthright. And now governments are watching, because they know. A generation that understands its value cannot be exploited. A student who knows his history cannot be erased. A young woman who sings for her country cannot be sold lies. This is what the Patriotic Immersion Program has unleashed. Not a curriculum, but a contagion of confidence. And confidence, when planted in the soul of a people, grows stronger than any flag, richer than any gold. At first, the international community responded with something unusual. Silence. No press releases, no policy statements, no coverage from the usual channels. BBC, CNN, Reuters, all quiet. Because how do you explain children in one of the poorest nations on earth standing proud, declaring loyalty to their homeland, while children in richer countries scroll TikTok in search of meaning? How do you justify centuries of colonial education when 10-year-olds in Burkina Faso are quoting Sankara? But silence doesn't last long, not when control is threatened. Soon the headlines began to shift. From the UK, Burkina Faso indoctrinates youth with nationalist program. From France, concerns rise over military-style civic training in West Africa. From the US, should the West be worried about Africa's shift in youth identity? The worry wasn't about human rights. It wasn't about child welfare. It was about power, and power is never given up easily. One French analyst went further, saying, "This is a dangerous direction. If young Africans grow up distrusting the West, we lose our influence." Let that sink in. Not worry that children were unsafe, not concern for education quality, but panic that loyalty might shift from foreign flags to African soil. And when the French embassy in Ouagadougou attempted to request clarity, the Burkina Faso government issued a sharp response. Our education is no longer your concern. A commentator in Washington labeled the program ideological reprogramming, to which one Burkina Faso mother replied on national radio, "Yes, because for 60 years our children were programmed to forget who they are. It's time to relearn." And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso, calm, firm, unmoved. When asked about the backlash, he said simply, "When we teach our children about their land, their history, their strength, that is not propaganda, that is liberation." And the world noticed that he never raised his voice. He never pointed fingers. He just built something the West could not control: belief. And belief is dangerous because it cannot be bombed, it cannot be sanctioned, it cannot be bribed. This was not a military threat. It was a cultural revolution, and revolutions terrify empires. Suddenly, think tanks scrambled to draft reports. NGOs began suggesting counter-narrative educational tools. Foreign ministries discussed soft engagement strategies because they knew this wasn't just a policy, it was a precedent. If Burkina Faso could reclaim its children's minds, what would stop Mali, or Guinea, or Congo? If children no longer dream of foreign passports, what happens to brain drain? If they start dreaming of building Africa, who will be left to serve empire? Traoré never gave a long speech about Western hypocrisy. He didn't need to. The children were doing the speaking, and the world was listening, nervously. Because this, more than oil or gold or uranium, is what the West fears most. An Africa that teaches its children to love itself without permission. There are moments in history when a generation is not simply born, it is shaped. And in the dusty schoolyards of Burkina Faso, under the rising sun and the rhythm of ancestral drums, something profound is happening. A generation is being shaped, not by foreign dreams, but by ancestral truth. These children, once raised on cartoons where heroes spoke only English, are now quoting Thomas Sankara. They know who Patrice Lumumba was. They've memorized not only the map of Africa, but the names of African freedom fighters who died for their right to stand tall. They greet their elders in their native tongues. They honor their mothers, not with gifts, but with service. They do not aspire to leave. They aspire to build. In one school in eastern Burkina Faso, students now begin every day by reciting a new pledge. I am a child of Africa. I will not be bought. I will not forget. I will protect my land, my people, and my truth. No curriculum imported from Paris. No testing standards approved by Washington. Just purpose, pure and powerful. This is not mere education reform. This is a civic resurrection. For decades, African youth were sold an idea that success meant leaving, that dignity came from degrees earned abroad, that the West was the mirror of excellence. But this generation is breaking that mirror. One teacher, moved to tears, described the change. They used to draw pictures of America. Now they draw our villages, our flags, our heroes. Because when a child believes that their story matters, they stop begging for someone else's. And this is what the Patriotic Immersion Program has done. It has birthed a cohort of young citizens who know not just what to think, but who they are. And with that knowledge, they are becoming unbreakable. They are less addicted to foreign media, less dazzled by imported clothes, less ashamed of their names, their skin, their accents, and more grounded, more focused, more defiant, not in anger, but in clarity. These are not children who will grow up to be yes men. They will not nod silently in boardrooms while their countries are auctioned off. They will not sign contracts in languages their grandmothers never spoke. They will not kneel for visas or bow for grants. They will question, they will resist, they will lead. And this is the legacy of Ibrahim Traoré Burkina Faso. Not a speech, not a monument, but a generation. One student said it best during a community celebration. They told us we were too poor to lead, but we are rich with memory, and now we know where we are going. That child may never make international headlines, but she has already made history. Because once a people reclaim their children, once a nation rewrites its curriculum, once a continent teaches love for itself, empires begin to crumble, and the future, long hidden, long stolen, begins to rise. Do you think this is the kind of education Africa has been waiting for? Tell us below. Your voice matters. This is how nations are born, not through war, but through wisdom. While the world debated politics and power, Burkina Faso chose something deeper, identity. And from that choice, a miracle emerged, not of economics, but of spirit. For decades, the continent's children were fed borrowed dreams. They learned to recite Shakespeare before they heard a line of Sankara. They chased foreign flags while forgetting their roots. They laughed at their languages. They ran from their skin. But now the mirror has been cleaned. Now the reflection has changed. Now the child sees not a victim, but a builder. And that builder begins with 3 weeks of immersion, 3 weeks of grounding, 3 weeks of truth. One policy, one president, one people, and the spark has been lit. The question is no longer, can it work? It already is. The real question is, will the rest of Africa follow? Will our children ever know a future where they are not taught to forget? If this story made your heart stand taller, don't just watch, like, share, subscribe, because the future is not written in Paris or Washington. It's written in the hearts of our children. Raise your voice in the comments. Proud to be African? Raise them strong. Africa rise. Education is power. This is our time. Because what we teach today is what we live tomorrow. And this time, Africa is teaching truth.